Back in September of 2023, the Boston Public Library joined the Books Unbanned initiative, funded by private support raised by the Boston Public Library Fund. This initiative was kicked off in 2022 by the Brooklyn Public Library, and Boston was the third library system to join the network, which also includes the Seattle Public Library, San Diego Public Library, and LA County Library. By joining this initiative, the BPL embraces the opportunity to champion the principle of access for individuals across the nation who face limitations in reaching content and are unable to advocate for themselves by offering a library card to anyone in the country between the ages of 13 and 26. This card gives them access to a curated collection of ebooks that have been banned throughout history. Since the initiative started a year ago, we have seen over 6,000 registrations from all 50 states, plus Puerto Rico, Guam, and the American Samoa. And over 11,000 books have been checked out. When people sign up for a Books Unbanned library card, they leave a brief quote on why this initiative is important to them. Here's a quote from a young adult in Texas that we received this month. "I cannot access free knowledge inside my state where many books on minorities and discrimination topics are banned. I want to educate myself and open myself to the world and free resources." Today's participants will talk about the recent spate of book bannings across the country, and what that means for the right to read. We have a terrific panel to address this topic, who I will briefly introduce before turning things over to our guest moderator. All the way over to your left, Kelly Brotzman is the Executive Director of Prison Book Program in Quincy, a 50-year-old nonprofit devoted to sending free, high-quality books and reading materials to people in prisons and jails across the country. Under Kelly's leadership, PBP has grown tremendously, holding nearly 200 volunteer sessions per year and expanding to serve incarcerated readers in all 50 states. Her passion for supporting people in prison comes from her experience teaching college classes in prisons and volunteering as the academic mentor to incarcerated college students. In the middle, we have Cory Doctorow, who is a science fiction author, activist, and journalist. He's the author of many books, most recently The Bezel, a follow-up to Red Team Blues, and The Lost Cause, a solar punk science fiction novel of hope amidst the climate emergency. His most recent nonfiction book is The Internet Con, How to Seize the Means of Computation, a big tech disassembly manual. Other recent books include Red Team Blues, a science fiction crime thriller, Choke Point Capitalism, nonfiction about monopoly and creative labor markets, the Little Brother series for young adults, and in 2020, he was inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. And then, next to me here, Leah Johnson is the author of award-winning books for children and young adults. Her best-selling debut YA novel, You Should See Me in a Crown, was a Stonewall Honor Book, the inaugural Reese's Book Club YA pick, and was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 best young adult books of all time. Her second middle grade, Bree Boyd, is a legend, is forthcoming from Disney Hyperion in March 2025. When she's not writing, you can find her at Loudmouth Books, her Indianapolis-based independent bookstore that specializes in highlighting the work of marginalized authors and uplifting banned or challenged books. Just one quick note before I introduce the moderator. We have Derek from Trident Booksellers outside. He'll be selling copies of Cory and Leah's books afterwards if you want to pick one up and get them signed. Finally, to moderate tonight's conversation, I'd like to introduce Caroline Burke, a longtime patron of Teen Central here at the Central Library in Copley Square. A musical theater actor, slam poet, and filmmaker, Caroline is responsible for the creation of our seasonal Teen Arts Cafe, a truly open mic night, which, thanks to her, is now running strong for its third year. Caroline created this event not to showcase her own myriad talents, but to give teen artists a space to be their uninhibited selves, to share their words without the constraint of judgment or censorship. Her work has often discussed controversial issues in the realms of feminism, neurodivergence, and sexual assault. So tonight's topic is of particular importance to her as a young artist. Please welcome Caroline.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're just going to start off the panel with a question for everyone. So, what are the long-time dangers of censorship at its worst? And what are your fears regarding the effects of censorship, both on a societal scale as well as to the individual, would you say?
Can you hear me? I guess I'll go. I mean, I guess the long-term risk is totalitarianism. It's pretty much a straight line. between censorship and control, the loss of freedom, I would say. The loss of many freedoms. I would say another long-term risk is the complete destruction of creativity. And, the sort of Orwellian world, I guess, is what we would inhabit, if censorship were universal. So that's a pretty simple and short answer, but I think that is my answer.
Yeah, first of all, Caroline, I don't like that I can't see you, my girl. You're asking the questions, I can't even address you, but just know I'm paying attention to you. Okay, so in Indiana, which is where I'm from, where I work and write, et cetera, we had a House bill come up last year during our legislative session that would have criminalized educators and librarians for having certain books on the shelf. And so we're not just talking about like an ideological battle, even though that too is worthy of a lot of attention and concern, but we're talking about a change in people's actual material conditions. And so people don't get into the information sciences, I don't imagine, to be criminalized. And so we had a lot of fear and intimidation that was coming along with, sharing diverse stories. But past all of that, which is an actual physical, literal concern, I think if this was just about the removal of stories from shelves, that would be one conversation. But I know, and y'all know, that this isn't about that. This is about a removal of a certain set of people from public life. And so if you can make stories about queer folks, about BIPOC folks, feel like they are dangerous or feel like they are something to be afraid of or ashamed of, then you are going to drive the people who create those stories and who those stories are about into fear and shame and hiding. And so when we talk about the long-term effects of, censorship or book banning, we can't ignore the fact that, one, these are being hidden or censored or banned or challenged because they are a threat to people in positions of power. And then we have to ask, why are they a threat to people in positions of power? And then from there, we can begin to unravel, okay, how this is connected to fascism, how it's connected to, a much larger issue of reduction in access.
So I want to say something that might be slightly controversial about book banners, which is that they're not wrong about one thing. And the thing they're not wrong about is that these books are dangerous, right? The reason that I think that when we are fighting back against book bans, there's an impulse to say, oh, it's just a story, right? You're overreacting. It's just a story. It's not going to change anyone's mind. People aren't going to become radicalized by these books. Of course they're going to become radicalized by these books. That's why we want the books on the shelves, right? It's so that we can have progress, so that we can know who we are. Like, it is absolutely true that if you don't know the word for who you feel you are, and you don't know that other people feel they're that way too, you might go to your grave never having told anyone who you truly are. And if you are lucky enough to know who you truly are, you should assume that someone you love in your life has never told you who their authentic self is, because they might not even have the words. So this is why we want the books unbanned. So I'm a science fiction writer, and I have this colleague, a very brilliant guy, William Gibson, who's full of these great aphorisms. And one of them is, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And when he said it, he meant like, oh, you go to Japan and they got the coolest gadgets. But there's another way of thinking about this, which is that if you have a terrible technology idea, right, something that like an affluent, well-spoken, connected, middle-class white guy like me would never tolerate, you have to find someone whose complaints don't get an airing. And you have to sand down the rough edges of that technology on the least among us. And then you continue knocking those corners off on the bodies of people, working your way up the privilege gradient, prisoners and asylum seekers, and then students and blue-collar workers, people in mental asylums, and so on. And eventually it works its way up the privilege gradient. I call it the shitty technology adoption curve. And so if you want to know what the future, particularly of electronic access to text, looks like, and which is to say what the future of a world where access to books is limited, look to the people who have the least. So 15 years ago, working with a nonprofit that I've been involved with for a quarter of a century now, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I helped draft a UN treaty called the Marrakesh Treaty on the rights of people with disabilities to access copyrighted works. And the Marrakesh Treaty was basically about things like, okay, so there's volunteers in France who read books aloud for people with visual disabilities, but they're not allowed to send those books to Quebec. They're not allowed to send those books to Rwanda. They're not allowed to send those books to Martinique because of copyright. And we just want to make it easier for people with disabilities. We want to expand the definition so that people who don't have arms and can't turn a page are able to access an ebook or an audiobook. The American Association of Publishers and the World Association of Publishers went bananas, right? They just absolutely did not want to countenance this. They sent the US Trade Representative to fight it. We eventually did get the treaty passed. The US has never ratified it, other countries have. The US Trade Representative went back to South Africa last year to object to an inclusion of the rights of people with disabilities to access copyrighted works, which is mostly about ebooks and audiobooks, again saying that this would be a threat to American IP interests. I helped start an NGO in Uganda called Access to Information Africa in the wake of the US Trade Representative on behalf of American textbook publishers, ordering libraries at universities to remove their photocopiers on pain of not having their accreditations recognized in the United States, so that students couldn't go to the library and photocopy the one copy of a book so that they could access it later. I mean, the pettiness, the meanness of it, right? The seeking after of parochial advantage, the smallest parochial advantage at the expense of the people who have the least, is, I think, what book bans are at their foundation, right? It's about taking people who don't have power and taking what little they have from them. And we just saw the Internet Archive lose a lawsuit over scanning books and then lending them out to one person at a time, and briefly during the pandemic, more than one person at a time. And the reason they're doing that is that publishers won't sell ebooks to libraries. No library buys an ebook. Libraries license an ebook, and that license says you can only lend it out so many times, you can only keep it in your holdings for so many years, and it comes with all kinds of surveillance features, right? These are things that like real books don't have, and it's going to cost 5 to 10 times as much as a real book. And so the way that the libraries got around this, there's a guy named Bobby Glushko, who's the head librarian at UMass Amherst, who's my old intern, who was a librarian. He started scanning the books in the holdings and letting other libraries access them. And it went to the appellate division, and he won that this was fair use. And so the Internet Archive started doing this with other library systems on this basis. And they just lost a lawsuit that the publishers brought. And so we're going back 2 big steps on ebooks to the place where libraries can't have a copy of an ebook except on these onerous licensing terms. And so libraries are headed in a direction where prisons have been for a long time, because prisons are removing their libraries at the rate of knots and replacing them with tablets. And the tablets sell you access to books at a significant markup relative to the cost of the books that you would buy on the outside. And then they can be revoked, they can be surveilled. So really, like, the future is here. It's not evenly distributed, but it pools up pretty thick around the people who are the least of us, who are at the bottom of the shitty technology curve. And so if you want to know what the future looks like, just look at them, right? They're the early adopters of totalitarianism.
Thank you guys for that. We're going to segue now into a question specifically for Leah. So Leah, from the perspective of a young reader growing up in a liberal state, Massachusetts, I was surprised that the content in You Should See Me in a Crown was seen as controversial. I know that you're from Indiana, which is a more conservative part of the United States. So I was wondering if you could comment on how your community and upbringing impacted your content that you could consume, as well as the types of content that you sought out.
I love this question, and I'm going to answer it in 5 different parts. Point 1. Okay, so first and foremost, my book, the first time I was notified about my book being banned. Now, mind you, they don't just send you a notice every time your book gets banned or challenged. You have to find out on your own. Otherwise, you won't be able to fight it or challenge it in any way. And so I was notified through Google Alerts because obviously I have a Google Alert set up on my own name. And the alert was that the Oklahoma Attorney General's office had banned or brought about a case that was going to ban You Should See Me in a Crown in public schools under the basis of obscenity. Now, if you haven't read You Should See Me in a Crown, you should know it's about a queer black girl from Indiana who just wants to win prom queen so she can get a scholarship to go to college. And in that process, she falls in love with her competition for queen. They kiss a total of 2 times in that book. I was told I could only use the F-bomb 1 time in that book, otherwise they wouldn't put it in the book fair. And so really, if the book is being challenged under the guise of obscenity, you have to believe that queerness is inherently obscene. There's nothing else that even could be considered obscene, right? And so that was an immediate wake-up call very early on in my career to the fact that while this book had done so much to liberate me personally, I wasn't out when I wrote You Should See Me in a Crown, did not know if it was going to be possible for me to be queer and black and a woman and have a happy ending in the end where I got to be all those things without fear or shame. This book had done so much to liberate me that I had forgotten somehow in the process why I had been so afraid to write it to begin with. And so when we talk about the ways that lack of access changes people's perception of self, I think my writing of You Should See Me in a Crown is a really good example of that. I grew up in a place where I didn't have access to stories where there were a lot of black girls. The only stories I saw where people fell in love, they were white girls from the coast, from places like Massachusetts. And so I thought if I wanted to have a story like that, I was going to have to be a straight white girl from Massachusetts. And as you all know, that wasn't going to be possible for me. And so, once I let go of that delusion and tried to step into this, reality of, okay, this is my life and this is what we're going to do with it, it took books to give me the language, like you were talking about, give me the language to define who I am on my own terms. And so, when we talk about access, I always bring up Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who, came up with this theory of windows and doors, or windows and mirrors, which is that books give us windows into experiences unlike our own, and they give us mirrors that reflect our experiences back to us. And those mirrors are affirming, they are validating, but almost as importantly as the mirror is the window, which is that this is the thing, this is a text that can connect me to my neighbor in a way that I wasn't connected before. And so because I didn't have that growing up, 1, I didn't know if it was possible to be all those things, but 2, I also didn't think that anybody around me was going to be able to see me for who I was. And that's a really sad, but also a dangerous place to be, especially in a world where we are so often divided along lines of identity. And all that sort of changed for me when I moved to New York, which was very liberal. I went to a school called Sarah Lawrence, where everybody was weird and gay, just like me. And so, being there sort of changed my perspective. And it was only because I got that time being surrounded by those people who felt similar to me and who understood where I was coming from that I felt empowered enough to move back home and then start to do some of that work or undo some of the work that had been done to me.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'm just going to go right down the line. Here's a question for Cory specifically. Do you think that science fiction is a vehicle for discussing ideas that would be banned in traditional fiction?
Yeah, it's historically served that role, and historically, junk and trash is a place where you can do stuff that you can't do in the spaces that get scrutinized for seriousness.
Romance, okay? Romance, for instance, just for an example.
100%. Yeah, and stuff coded for groups of people that aren't taken seriously, kids, women. You can do a lot of daring things. And, I was mentored by this wonderful writer and editor and critic named Judith Merrill. And Judy wrote all kinds of stuff that challenged traditional gender ideas in the 40s and 50s in science fiction because she could, right? Because science fiction was not a place anyone was looking. She had a peer, Samuel Delany, who was the first widely read gay black science fiction writer who was out. He did the same in that period. And if you've ever seen, today Delany is thought of as this great kind of towering literary guy. Go find his first editions on eBay. I mean, you can't afford them, but go look at them. They are the crummiest pulp paperbacks you have ever seen. He was published in like 25-cent paperbacks with cover paintings that just had, ladies with big boobs hanging out that had nothing to do with the story, that just by the cheapest, most exploitative publishers in the world, which is how he got to write this incredible, amazing, bizarre stuff, because no one was looking too hard. But it's a two-edged sword. So for a long time, comics was a place where people were really experimental. And then a guy named Frederick Wortham got really upset that kids were reading stuff in comics that was not child appropriate in his view and contributing to the moral decay of American children. He wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, and he went on a whistle-stop tour of America. He started getting comic store owners thrown in the slam for distributing obscenity to minors. And he ultimately convinced the comics industry to do a self-regulation move called the Comics Authority. If you've ever bought like an old Archie comic with a little A in the corner, that's the Comics Authority seal of approval, and it verifies that there's nothing in it that wouldn't be appropriate for children. And for a long time, comics entered a real downturn. One of the things about the Comics Authority is that because it was a kind of star chamber, where it was not a government agency, it was self-regulation by a cartel of giant publishers, Marvel and DC mostly, but a couple of the other big publishers. You never knew exactly what the rules were, but like, for example, there weren't a lot of black superheroes, and people who drew black superheroes said, oh, well, we would get those comics sent back for excessive violence. And they wouldn't be beating up bad guys in a way that, was in any way more violent than the way Batman was beating them up. But Batman was a white billionaire, and these guys were, black superheroes. And so people started to self-censor, to color really far in the lines. One thing that we don't appreciate enough about censorship is that the majority of censorship is not undertaken by governments. It's undertaken by intermediaries like publishers, by librarians, by teachers, by distributors who are worried that the government will come after them. And so because they don't know where the edge of the line is, they stay inside the line. My colleague Ada Palmer, who studies the Inquisition, talks about how the Inquisition had very few rules about what you couldn't publish, but that publishers knew that if you broke the rules, you were in for a world of hurt, quite literally. And so publishers stayed really far inside those lines, and how that was the most effective way of accomplishing censorship. And so, the risk of staying in the greasy kid stuff universe, right, of doing stuff that is not taken seriously, is that if someone figures out what you're doing, they get really angry, because they say, what are you doing writing in this domain for the vulnerable, the thick-headed, and the foolish, with these big ideas that people could take the wrong way? And they come after you, and because it's a literature that no one takes seriously, no one sticks up for you. They're like, oh, well, they're just censoring the comic books. And so nobody goes, well, that's terrible, the way they might if they were censoring Broadway.
Thank you, Cory. Lastly, for this specific questions, for Kelly, according to the Marshall Project, Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power is banned in U.S. prisons, presumably because the knowledge within it may threaten the order of security within the prison system. Do examples like this serve to suggest that some censorship is reasonable? Are there other examples of necessary censorship in and outside the prison system?
Well, the prison system certainly believes that a lot of censorship is necessary. So, for example, we routinely get things returned because they, let's say this person is incarcerated for crimes of a sexual nature, and so they should not have certain kinds of romances, or they shouldn't have certain kinds of photography books. They always tie it back to the institution's security. And so, and we just the other day, we had requests for photos of children. Send me books with photos of children. And so those are the tough calls. Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power is not a tough call at all. It's, supposedly about mind control or something like that. I mean, the stuff that's banned that is truly, truly dangerous is like George Jackson, the writings of George Jackson, who, when he was incarcerated at Soledad, talked about organizing incarcerated people to literally wage the revolution that would break their chains. And so that stuff gets rejected all the time by the prisons, but I don't think that's a justification of any kind for what it is basically an excuse to prevent people from intellectual liberation. And so the kinds of censorship that the prison system exercises, and one of our volunteers actually suggested that I should begin my remarks here after these two people by saying, hold my beer, because the kind of and scope of censorship that prisons exercise is enormous compared to the kinds of censorship we're seeing in book banning that we're seeing in communities and in schools. It's enormous. Any book can be banned. But those censorship attempts are actually counter to the true safety of any kind of rehabilitative environment. They actually foil the safety. I mean, they actually make the prison less safe, because when people are not allowed to access the kinds of information and the kinds of books that they want, it's not serving safety. It's actually making the place more dangerous. We have tough calls all the time. For example, we just don't carry, I mean, for people who don't know, we send free books to people in prison. We don't carry true crime, because it would never get in. Not because we don't want people to learn true crime stories, but because the prison would never allow it in. So it would be a waste of precious resources in our case. Erotica is always a sort of contested category, It's like we carry it, and sometimes we send it, and sometimes it gets in. Although we found that material that gets rejected based on, sexually explicit tends to be LGBTQ material rather than like 50 Shades of Grey. And so, we make those judgment calls all the time, and it really depends on who's in the space on that particular day. We have got 1,400 people who volunteer with us every year. So, but it's very tough, and I think when we talk about safety, another thing we don't carry a lot of is like backwoods survival. Because there's usually instructions for how to kill an animal or how to sharpen weapons, make poisonous substances to control pests and things like that. And again, it's like, we got a welding book in one time. There's any book can pose a safety threat. And so, I think it's really just we find actually that the books that are rejected for violent content, it's because of pictures. So comics are much more likely to be rejected for violence than books that in words describe violence, because I don't think they're actually reading the books. They're just looking at the pictures. The guards are when they screen the books. So I would say no, there's no censorship that is strictly necessary, even in a prison environment. But again, we have to make practical decisions about how to use limited resources. So therefore, we just don't tend to take donated books on true crime. That's a sort of a non-answer, but that's my answer.
I thought it was I think it's definitely an answer for sure. I think it's interesting though, the parallels that exist between like censorship in the prison system and the censorship in like high schools, because it's like that's a totally different group of people. And I think the fact that there were parallels there between what Leah was discussing and what you, Kelly, were discussing kind of just goes to show how extreme the censorship can be.
Well, they're in the same spot on the shitty technology adoption curve, right? They're just down here on the privilege gradient, and so the same stuff's happening to all of them. They're early adopters.
Absolutely. So this is a question about the writing process in general. So were there any pieces of content that as you were writing, you could foresee becoming banned material? And if so, how did this forecasting affect your writing process? And has it caused you to self-censor yourself? Which I know you definitely touched on already, Leah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, let's be real with each other. There are a lot of people who wish I did not exist. And I mean that pretty frankly, who, if they had the choice to wave a wand and no more Black queer women were on this planet, I'd be out of here. Which, obviously sucks. But if I allowed myself to make decisions about the life that I lead based on those people, I wouldn't even get out of bed in the morning, let alone sit down at a blank page and have the audacity to write a book about people and experiences that mirror my own. And so, yes, I will say early on in my career, I had, You Should See Me in a Crown was my first book, and I was really fortunate that I had seen a lot of success with that book. But with that success came a lot more eyes on me before I got to write a book completely free of all criticism, because nobody knew I existed. And also, nobody was going to read the book, I thought. And so I wrote a little gay story with all my little hopes and dreams in there. I was hoping to retcon all the things that I wasn't able to do in high school. And I was like, my mom will buy a copy or two if she's feeling wild, and that'll be that. And after I saw that wasn't the case, my work was scrutinized much more heavily than I anticipated it would be. And so for my second book, I was thinking constantly in the process of drafting it about all the things in the book that people would find objectionable. And at some point, I had to completely let go of the idea that there was a way for me to write a book that was honest, that wasn't going to incense someone out there who really just would rather I not exist anyway. So you can't write a character who is quiet enough or demure enough or smart enough or generous enough for people who would rather you not have those identities at all. And so at some point you just had to let that idea go, that there is a way to write towards those people who are never going to accept you. And so I did. And somehow I keep selling my little gay Black books. But that is not the case for most of my peers. When I wrote, not even when I wrote, but when I got the deal for You Should See Me in a Crown. This is a long answer, Caroline, stick with me. So when I got the deal for my first book, it was 2018, and CCBC, which is like a think tank about children's literature, had released a study that said in the 3 years prior to 2018, in all of traditional publishing, there had been 20 books with a Black girl as a main character. Of all the books that were published, and of those 20 books, only one had a Black queer girl as a main character. And that book was a sleeper hit. It's Little and Lion by Brandy Colbert, which is a book that many people in this room probably have not heard of. And so I knew that I was writing into a space that was largely empty, but my success could create more space for the people who come after me. And that's not to say that the people who have since written books like mine have not had to face the same level of scrutiny, but it is to say that the space changes when you are bold enough to write the thing anyway, despite the people who wish you would be silent.
That's a great answer.
Thank you. It took me a while to land, but y'all stuck with me, and I appreciate that.
So I started off writing books for adults, and then I started writing young adult fiction. And my first young adult novel, I was sort of struggling with the concept of young adult. I'm a recovering library worker, I'm an ex-bookseller, and I figured, I guess the definition, and this is going to be hopelessly naive in today's environment, I guess the definition of young adult is a book that a teen librarian could give to a kid without getting in trouble, right? And 2006, that was sort of the definition of young adult. And I wrote this book that kind of pushed that edge a little. It was called Little Brother. It's about kids in San Francisco after a terrorist attack that blows up the Bay Bridge, who find that the Department of Homeland Security have turned their city into a kind of armed police state. And they decide that they're going to push back against it. And they use this network of hacked, cryptographically secured Xboxes to build a guerrilla army, kick the DHS out of San Francisco, and restore the Bill of Rights.
Just something slight, just really easy.
Rousing kind of teen rebellion kind of story, right? It did well, and it didn't get librarians into trouble until it did. And so I got a call, or I got an email from a teen services librarian, teacher librarian at Booker T. Washington High in Pensacola, Florida, one spring saying, we've got a summer one book, one school program. Would you be interested in coming out to Pensacola next year if we all read it over the summer? And I said, hell yeah, I'd be delighted. And then the next email, and then I made her a video and it talked to the kids and whatever. And the next email I got from her was, our principal has canceled the entire summer reading program so that none of the kids would read your book. Okay. This is the principal of Booker T. Washington High. Just let that sink in for a minute. And because Florida's a right-to-work state and she's not unionized, her job was in jeopardy. The National Coalition of Teachers of English and the American Coalition Against Censorship saved her job. But the book was banned, and the principal's argument was, this book is dangerous. It's going to teach kids all the wrong kinds of lessons. And this gets me back to my first point, which is, like, he's not exactly wrong, right? So in 2013, I went to a movie theater to see this documentary that Laura Poitras made called Citizen4 about a guy named Edward Snowden. And in this movie, they meet Edward Snowden, the American whistleblower, who's in a hotel room in Hong Kong. And about a third of the way or halfway through, maybe a little later, he needs to leave. He needs to go underground and he needs to get out of the country because the NSA has figured out where he is. So he grabs the things that he's going to take with him when he goes on the road from off his bedside table, and one of them is my book. And so it does make people a little, want to do radical things if you do it right. It's not the worst thing. There's a new edition of the book that I think the bookseller has that he wrote an afterword for, an introduction to. And it's, one of the proudest moments of my life. So I didn't quite self-censor. I also wrote a book about prison tech. My last novel is The Bezel's, a crime thriller about people who decide to destroy the hedge fund that's supplying tablets to prisons. Someone inside, someone outside is a revenge story. And I knew that prisoners wouldn't be allowed to read it, but it turns out some of them were. And so I just heard from a prisoner who's just gotten out, and he read it in prison, and he had one of these tablets. So he didn't get it for free. A lot of the prisons give them to you for free as like a sticky trap, and then you have to buy all the content for it. He actually had to work for it, and the American average prison wage is 53 cents an hour. So he had to work to buy this thing, but because he bought it, it was his, so they let him take it with him. But of course, as soon as you take it out of the prison and it can't reach the prison Wi-Fi, it bricks itself. It's like this terrible joke. Anyway, he was like, do you know anyone who'd do a teardown and an audit and a forensic report on one of these tablets? I was like, I certainly do. So I've just dropped it off. It's going to the Chaos Communications Congress in Hamburg this year, and there's this wrecking crew of elite hackers who are going to tear it down and do a full forensic workup on it. So sometimes writing books that push the envelope can get you some good stuff in the world.
Absolutely. I have a creative writing teacher at Brandeis that always tells us to just, when you think you're done, write for another minute and just see what happens, right? And it's interesting how sometimes, like, when you think you're done, there's another layer that exists, like, beyond that you can, it's really interesting to explore that. And I feel like that's when some of the most, like, thought-provoking stuff comes out. Leah's like.
I love that. Mm-hmm. I'll be using that.
That's so Kelly Link, who's the proud daughter of Massachusetts, a pal of mine, we both taught, you got another bookseller, we both taught at the Clarion Workshop, which is a science fiction workshop. And I once wrote to her and I was like, I'm going to teach this summer. I want to bring some new stuff to the students. What do you know? And she's like, my top advice is when you're finished writing, go and look at your last sentence and see if you really need it. And if you don't, cross it out. And then if you need the current last sentence, cross that. If you don't need that one, cross that out. Because you're just going to keep going after you're done. Because you're just in the habit. You're just keep cross, and then go to the beginning and take the first sentence and see if you really need that, because you're like warming up when you're starting. Cross that out. Just keep crossing out sentences until you can no longer have a beginning, and then uncross out the last sentence. And it's like the opposite. I could totally see how both of these things can be true.
Yeah.
Write for another 5 minutes, but also cross out the last sentence.
Matter of fact, throw the whole thing away.
Yeah.
That's my motto.
Get
Throw the
a
whole book
real
out.
job.
This is like
Quit creative work entirely.
This is like a perfect segue into like my final question here, because it's, as a young slam poet, I'd like to know what advice you would give to writers who are just starting out that you would have given to your past self when you first started writing. I think we only have a couple minutes left for the panel, but
Are you going to do your slides?
that's my final question.
So the best advice I never listened to, and it's not censorship related, it's just composition related, is to write every day. And I assume that this was just aspirational advice, like, eat 5 helpings of vegetables and do an hour of cardio every day. It's like what you do if you had a trainer and a chef, but like not what real people do. And it turns out that anything you do every day becomes a habit and you get it for free. And I just had this moment when I was working for EFF and doing this stuff at the UN and traveling all the time. I was on the road 27 days a month. I stopped plugging in my fridge because it was costing me $10 a month to keep my ice cubes frozen. And I had a book under contract and I needed to write, and I couldn't like woo the muse into the room with a candle and so on. I just like had to write plugged into the only plug in the airport lounge under the water fountain next to the bathroom in the 20 minutes I had and get my words in. And I realized that there were days where I felt like I was writing well and days when I felt like I was writing poorly. And there was work that in retrospect was terrible and needed to be rewritten, and work that was great and could stand as it was, but that they weren't correlated. That the correlative feeling like you were writing badly was like lack of sleep, being hungover, eating bad food, fighting with your girlfriend, getting your ass kicked in policy circles, whatever. And that if it like you would never like. It's now 20 some years later, I still feel those feelings, but I just know that I can just write when I feel like I'm writing terrible things. And because I just know intellectually, even though emotionally it feels terrible, I know intellectually that it might be fine. And thankfully I'm not that bright, because it took me 10 years to realize the corollary, which is maybe on the days where you feel great about what you're writing, it's terrible. Which made the whole thing a little anhedonic. I try not to dwell on that too much, but...
Ira Glass has this whole thing that he like. There's this video about taste that I used to watch all the time when I was a journalist, and I was like, "Why is my writing not good enough?" And his whole shtick is that it's not good enough because your taste is such that you want to live up to a standard that you maybe are not reaching in the draft you're writing right now or the story you're working on right now. But you can't allow the fact that your work isn't living up to your taste level to keep you from finishing the work. You still have an obligation to yourself and to the page to sit down and do it anyway. And it is going to suck. And it might be terrible. And frankly, it probably will be. But you have to finish the draft in order for it to get better. And so that is my advice. Also to, to something Cory said, I don't always write because, for the record, I feel like this is worth noting. I think you should be generous with yourself. I think sometimes it's just not possible to do what you want to do. But I will say, you can't be precious with yourself or with the writing. When I was poor, which I was poor for my entire life up until like the last 2 books, shout out to the mouse for giving me the book deal. But when I was broke, I was working 3 jobs and writing on the train on my way to work, or writing, on my phone as I was walking from one job to the next. And so you don't always get the privilege of like being the person who gets to sit down at your little typewriter and just like letting it all pour out at Walden Pond or wherever the fuck people write these days. Like, you have to just be in service to the work whenever you possibly can. And so give yourself grace. It's not always possible, but you absolutely should show up every single time you can show up.
That was a wicked Bay State reference.
Thank you. Thank you. She's a woman of taste.
Thank you guys so much for answering my question specifically, but now we're going to turn it over to our audience, both virtually and that we have here in person, and we're going to do a Q&A. So there's people with microphones here in the aisles. There they are. Yay! And if you have questions, raise your hands. I'll call on you and they'll come up to you. And
Caroline, can I ask a question before we get started? This is for Kelly. How do you keep showing up to the work even when it feels just like absolutely exhausting? Like, the penal system is so, I mean, I'm an abolitionist. I don't believe it should exist, but I also recognize that like in the institutions that we have to do what we can. And so like, what are you doing to take care of yourself? How are you showing up every day? Like, what are you doing?
Thanks for the question. When I first started teaching in prisons, it was soul-crushing. It was just absolutely soul-crushing. And the reason I decided to put incarcerated people more at the center of my life is because they are life-giving. I happen to, in my current position, every package that goes out that door feels like a little bit of a middle finger to a system that I absolutely hate. And so that's a little bit life-giving. And I think just knowing that, I think the real secret sauce to why our organization has been around for 52 years is that that package of books tells that person that they still matter to humanity, that they aren't garbage, because the prison system is the functional, as it exists in this country, is the functional equivalent of a giant garbage can for throwing human beings into. But that package tells them that's not true. And that is a message I will want to send for as long as I breathe. But in terms of taking care, we laugh a lot. I think coming to volunteer at Prison Book Program, people would say, is a very life-giving experience for them. They wouldn't keep coming back. We have people who volunteered with us for decades. They wouldn't keep coming back if it wasn't life-giving for them in the same kinds of ways. And again, just sort of saying no to the dehumanization, which is the fundamental premise of our prison system. Saying no to that, doing no to that every day is a form of resistance that, I find healthy.
Thank you so much.
Hey, so I actually did read Little Brother when I was a teen, and I remember it very much radicalizing me. That was a while ago. It was a long time ago, but I remember it definitely radicalized me back then. And I was thinking, that story is a radical story, but not all the stories that radicalize us have radical themes. Sometimes they're just about a girl who wants to be prom queen. And I wanted to ask, for all three of you, what stories, not necessarily books, have radicalized you or made you, that may not even be something that was meant to be radicalizing?
Oh my God. Oh, the pressure is on. Okay. You got it? Okay, go ahead.
So there's a writer, he's like a writer's writer. Like when you mention this to people, if they've heard of him, it's inevitably like, oh my God, you too? Oh, he's so great. His name is Daniel Pinkwater. You might know him because he, for a while, was like an NPR commentator. People at public libraries remember old NPR commentators. He has written over 100 books. He's still writing. He's written everything from picture books to young adult novels and memoirs. And he wrote a book about dog training called Super Puppy. I've read every book he's ever written. I never want to own a dog. I still read Super Puppy because it's so good. And his books are about misfits in weird worlds. And the one that got me, although he's written others, and maybe ones arguably that are even better, but the one that got me is a book called Alan Mendelsohn, The Boy from Mars, that is like indescribably weird and fantastic. He is just so great. Daniel Pinkwater.
Yeah, I like the language you use about how sometimes, well, maybe you didn't say this, but this is what I heard, and so I'm going to run with it, that sometimes it is radical to have a book that just makes you happy, especially in a world that is designed for us to always be reaching for something but never quite grasp it. And so for me, there were a lot of books growing up that just like gave me pure, unadulterated joy. But like I said, I didn't come out until I was in my 20s, and so a book for me that did that was like so influential is called Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, also extremely banned. And it's about a gay white kid in suburban Atlanta who is in a secret email relationship with another boy. And it is easily the single most influential like YA novel I read in that era of my life. I will also say Forever by Judy Blume, extremely banned book. Why is it I never read a book where a girl had any sense of agency over her body or her sexuality, except for Judy Blume? Because they were all banned.
You know, she updates Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret every couple of years with modern menstrual technology because it's how so many young women find out about their periods.
Yes. That's my girl. Judy Blume is my girl. There's a new book about her, The Truth About Judy. You guys should read it. It's fantastic.
There was also a great documentary about her recently that
You're so right, Caroline.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's a great documentary.
Someone bring the mic down here. Oh, yes. No. There you go, sir.
The destruction of a culture's art, literature, and history is the other half of the definition of genocide. And is it a stretch to say that the ultimate goal of the drive to eliminate books, as well as ban art and literature, as well as going after public libraries and public education, is not that on the edge of trying to eliminate gay people from society and gay history and black history and women's history?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I've done a lot of thinking about why it is in wars the libraries are among the first things to be targeted, in addition to hospitals and blah, blah, blah. Like when a war is being fought without rules and it's not really a war at all. And it has everything to do with history and a culture of erasure. And once you can erase a people's history, if you can erase a people's culture, if you can erase their language, I think Gloria Anzaldúa, always so many consonants in that last name, but she has this quote where it says, "Who's to say that robbing a people of their language is any less violent an act than war?" And I think when you can rob people of their language and rob them of their history, then you are stripping them not just of like who they are, but who they have the potential to be. And so I think it's crucial to think always about why they would want to take away our access to who we were in the process of, stripping away our ability to become something else.
Yeah, I think that, to go back to my first point, they're not wrong that the books that they want to ban are powerful, that having the words to say who you are is a powerful thing. Now, what I'll also say is that given the history of trying to erase people by erasing their language, by erasing their identity, by erasing their stories, it doesn't work as well as anyone hopes it will, and it always leads to mass graves. It's very hard to find an instance in history where all they did was burn the libraries, right? So, thinking about Canada where we had the residential, I'm a Canadian, we're like serial killers, where we would look just like everyone else. In Canada, we had the residential schools. The Catholic Church worked with the Canadian government to kidnap Indigenous kids and stick them in these schools. And their motto was, "Kill the Indian and save the man." And we have found with ground-penetrating radar many thousands of bodies of children outside of these schools in the last decade. There is no such thing as a program merely to eliminate culture that doesn't turn into a program of mass slaughter. So yeah, it's part of the definition of genocide. Obviously, this is a thing that weirdly enough we're arguing about in the 21st century, which is not a thing I thought we'd have to do. But it's also, in some ways, like, it's a distinction without a difference, because like they go together like peanut butter and chocolate. Like you don't find one without the other,
It just starts with ideology. It starts with language. It starts with texts. And of course, always evolves into something bigger. I think that's an important detail.
I would just add that art making is very prolific in prisons and jails. A lot of people take up drawing, poetry writing, forms of creative expression because the prison system tries to reduce human individuality, the numbers, the uniforms, right? It wants to sort of reduce everything down to sort of non-personhood, and taking up some sort of creative pursuit is a way to say no to that. It's very difficult for those stories to get told. And so it's another cog in sort of, as I was saying before, the dehumanization upon which the entire system depends. By making that art making and that storytelling so hard to find and so hard to consume, we're actually fighting against that because we have an art show called Art from Inside, which features art made by incarcerated artists that have been sent to prison book program over the years, and it's traveling all throughout greater Boston in public libraries, and that's just a way, again, I think, of saying you have the right to exist as part of the human family.
Think about like the media we consume. We consume so much media subconsciously, whether that be through TV, music, books, all of these things. And if we censor that as well, what we let go into like the public forum of what is acceptable to write about, make art about, talk about, that becomes what we as people say is okay to be. So it's like, it's not just art, it's like reflected in our daily lives at all times.
So this is reminding me of a book I want to recommend. So my colleague at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, David Moss, discovered this manuscript for a play called The Emperor of Atlantis that was written in a concentration camp. The Nazis had a show camp in Czechoslovakia where they sent artists, and they toured the press and the Red Cross through it to show just how great it was, and they encouraged them to make music and write plays. And so there was an opera written called The Emperor of Atlantis that is a satirical opera about genocide. It's an incredible work. It was written on the backs of deportation orders because they would siphon these people away and send them off to Auschwitz. And this was the paper that was available, were these deportation orders. And it was recovered eventually along with drawings of the costumes and so on. And Dave and a colleague wrote a graphic novel based on it called The Emperor of Atlantis. It's very, very good. It's really funny. It comes from a very dark place, but boy, oh boy, is it great.
We're going to turn it over to some questions online.
We have one question, and we've touched upon this a little bit already, but if you could elaborate a little bit more. How and where, by whom, is censorship in prisons and in schools being fought? And who are the heroes of these struggles? Thank you.
I can answer for prisons. Well, I think we're one of a couple of dozen groups across the country that send free books inside. We're probably one of the larger ones. But all of those groups are heroes in this movement. The ACLU is generally who you have to hire, or you have to get them to take your case if you're going to sue a Department of Corrections about access to books. So they're great heroes. PEN America is a huge hero. They know how to write the most sternly worded letters, and we're going to do this if you they will usually be your partner and backer if you decide to challenge a statewide ban or something like that. So those are the heroes. And there is, occasionally, sometimes, I don't know how to come back to survival and how you keep doing what you're doing. There is occasionally a staff member, usually a librarian inside, a prison librarian, an employee who understands that the books are not the problem. Generally, they get driven out of corrections work after a certain amount of time, but I've seen it happen where they have challenged from the inside, have challenged these bans, but it's ongoing. I mean, again, correctional systems can do all kinds of illegal things, and they do routinely, but you have to sue them to get them to stop doing the illegal things. And so, I think occasionally you'll find someone with whom you can be in solidarity on the inside, but you need resources in order to forward a case. And so people who donate to the ACLU, thank you, because they're the ones always at the forefront of these battles.
Yeah, I think for sure PEN America also keeps the most comprehensive list of book bans and challenges in the United States for schools and libraries. I would also say the ALA, the American Library Association, has been a huge help and resource to me in figuring out where the parties are that I should be allying with and aligning myself with to figure out where those resources are. So I would look to the ACLU, PEN America, absolutely, but also the ALA, because librarians are pretty badass, not gonna lie to you. But I will also say, on the other side of things, did a panel once with someone who was like, oh, the people who want to ban books are so stupid, they're so dumb, they're idiots. If they were so stupid, they wouldn't be so successful. We wouldn't be playing defense while they're playing offense. And so I would just like to encourage everybody, don't underestimate the people who are doing the work to ban and challenge books, because they are incredibly well organized, they're incredibly well funded, and they're showing up in rooms where we often are not. And so if you are in a community that has a school board, you should go to a school board meeting whether you have children or not. I will never have a child, but you know who's at the school board meeting causing hell, raising ruckus? Me. They hate to see me coming, okay? So just don't forget, Moms for Liberty are easy to laugh at, but they're not easy to beat.
There's a great umbrella group called the American Coalition Against Censorship that incorporates groups like the ACLU and the ALA, and it's like an umbrella group that coordinates activity. I would also mention the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which has been doing this work for a very long time. As I said, starting with the betrayal of the innocents, there's been these attacks on comic store owners and comics publishers, and CBLDF was funded to bail out these poor comic store guys who are facing prison sentences for selling a comic to a kid. And then I would, to your point, right, Moms for Liberty, very well organized, but if you want to give them their due, what they did was they recognized an undefended flank, right? And I work for an impact litigation firm, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Most of what we do is suing people about digital human rights, sometimes defending people. A lot of the times we're entering forums in which no one has ever bothered to put up a defense, because it's just a cozy boys club where everyone agrees that they should be screwing you. And we get in the room and all of a sudden it's like they have no idea what to do. It doesn't last forever, but for a while you can do these, small groups can do these highly leveraged attacks on institutions that are unregarded. And that is what Moms for Liberty did, right? It's not that they're stupid, it's not that they're poorly organized, but they aren't that numerous, right? When you actually look at the raw numbers.
There's like 12 people who have launched most of the book bans in this country.
But what they've done is they found a place no one else shows up at, right? And they figured out what the procedures were. And they showed up and they made a noise in a place that no one else was. If you go on YouTube and look up, and it's not just this, it's like water boards and like all kinds of little municipal boards. You go to YouTube where like open records laws are requiring like the water board to broadcast their meeting. These are things that are hugely consequential. Millions of dollars on the line, people's livelihoods, contracts being handed out, and literally it's two people in a room. Sometimes it's one person in a room. The whole water board is one person. And it's the most surreal thing. They read from a paper. They say, I would like to take a vote on this. I second the motion. I vote aye. The motion is carried, right? So these empty rooms, right, where like there's a kind of pantomime of democracy, someone else shows up and says, hell no, you should be giving your sweetheart contract to my buddy, or I see that you're giving a sweetheart contract to your buddy, and things can change really quickly. The good news is, if you show up in those rooms, stand for your library board, stand for your library trustees, go to the meetings of it, go to the Board of Ed. Again, like it's not that they are insurmountable or brilliant, right? They just had an insight that they could go to the place where no one else was and that they'd push on an open door. And all it takes is someone standing on the other side of that door pushing back, and a lot of those attacks collapse.
Thank you guys so much. We have time for one more question.
There's a person over here who had her hand up. Oh, two people. Can we squeeze two questions in? Maybe?
Can we?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what? You have some answers?
I actually have an interview from Dana Ellison Levy, who wrote a book called Ban. It's a children's book, and it's called Not Another Banned Book. And she has a list of 4 organizations that students and teachers and other people can go to fight banned books. And I can list them. One is PEN America, which has a great tip sheet for students on how to fight banned books, as well as a ton of other useful info. And I've got the URL, which is https://pen.org/freethebooks. And then there's also the National Coalition Against Censorship, also has a bunch of resources for everyone who wants to get involved. And it's ncac.org/ban books. Penguin Random House has partnered with PEN America for a series of helpful tools for students. And also Unite Against Book Bans has a variety of opportunities to get involved and get more information. And it's https://uniteagainstbookbans.org/get involved.
Thank you. Do we have time to squeeze in the last question down here? Or? Yeah, down here.
Yep.
Now it better be a really good question.
It's a craft question. I'm a writer, and I'm stuck at the beginning phase. You're all talking about how you got to where you are. I find that I get to a middle place in writing my stuff, and then all the voices come in, and my words, it's like my words sort of scatter out. So I wonder how you get over the hump to be able to finish it and shush the voices that are shutting you down.
Let me tell you this really quick. This is my quick answer. It doesn't matter whether I've been paid for the book or not. I sell a lot of books on proposal. I have to approach every single book like, if I don't finish it, my mortgage will not be paid. So if you think about the work, like the writing as if it is the work, capital T, capital W, trademark, I think it becomes a lot easier to just power through even when it's shitty. But I will also say, what's happening in the middle is you're reaching that point in the story, which is just like generally very complicated. The midpoint is always very difficult. But you're also recognizing by that point in the story, you're so deep in that you're like, oh my God, this thing that I did before is not gonna work if I want it to get here. Doesn't matter. You'll fix the first half eventually. You just have to power through. Even if you change course in the middle of the book, you just have to power through to the end as if your rent will not get paid unless you finish the book.
So I think that the way that we write is related kind of to the way that we understand people. So I think that like in the back of your mind, there's just a little like simulator where if you find out information about people, you feed that information and you try to build like a little model of them. And you say, like, if I asked them this, what would they say? Or what would my mom think of my dirty room? Or whatever, right? You've just got this idea, these little kind of homunculi of people. And it just happens automatically. And it can happen with people who don't exist. Like you can hear a rumor at school about the new kid, and it turns out there is no new kid, but you've still built up a whole picture around them. I think when you read, that's what's going on, that you're tricking the reader's brain into feeling empathy for people who don't exist, which is objectively a weird thing to do, because obviously like people who don't exist don't matter in some really important way. Like the yogurt you ate for breakfast had a more tragic death than Romeo and Juliet because it was actually alive and now it's dead, whereas Romeo and Juliet never lived, never died, and didn't matter by definition. I think when you write, the same thing happens. I think when you write, you start off saying like, putting on a slightly embarrassing puppet show for yourself. Like, let's go on a quest. That sounds great. Here we go. And you do it long enough, and the part of your brain that takes in input and models people starts to model your characters. And there comes this point where the ignition catches, and the characters, this is this precious thing writers say, start telling me what they want to do. And what you mean is, actually, I've got this person now modeled to a degree of fidelity that like, yeah, technically you're breathing in your own farts here, but really you're like, your brain is like making, the part of your brain that you don't normally consciously access is making up stuff that gives these characters richness and depth. There comes a point when you've been doing that for a while, you're like, wait a second, I haven't thought consciously about what is going on here. I have these characters that are telling me what to do. How do I know that that is good? What I need to do is I need to stop, reread everything, sketch it out, make it rational, figure out what's going to happen. And when you do that, you forcefully remind yourself that this is a puppet show you're putting on for yourself. And the characters go back to being things where you are contriving their actions rather than collaborating with the part of your brain that does this stuff automatically. So you have to resist that temptation. Don't look down. So long as you look down, you won't notice that you've run off the edge of the cliff, and you can keep going. But you look down, and like the prophet Wile E. Coyote told us, you know, you are going down to the bottom, and there'll be a poof and a cloud and all the rest of it. So. Thank you, Caroline.
I want to thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion. I want to thank our terrific moderator, Caroline Burke. Thank you. And Leah and Cory will be out there in a minute to sign any books if you want to pick up one of their recent books. And on October 19th, a Saturday morning, we're having it's part of a national day of action where public libraries across the country are going to be doing right to read rallies. We're working with Pen America, which was mentioned several times, to do this. It's going to be out on the stairs in front of the historic building over there. So stop by, and Caroline's going to be there and talking again, and a bunch of other people, so you can hear what we're talking about, the right to read. Thank you once again, everyone.